All right, thank you all for being here tonight. I have a lot of slides. I love this topic, and I'm going to try to cram too much information in. So hold on your seats. We got a lot of time for questions afterwards, so I'm going to defer it to then. All right, so passive house and net zero. There's some conversation. It's either or, and no, it's like it's an and. It's an and. There are some situations where we want one. There's some situations where we want the other. And I'm going to take a high-level view to go into this topic, and then touch a little bit on how they've been delivered, how the ones I've been involved in have been delivered. So we got to know our goal. You know, what do you want to deliver? Who are you delivering it to? Are you delivering it to your client? Are you delivering it to the end user? Or are you delivering it to society? Who and how? What you are creating you have to define it from the beginning, and then it will lead you either down towards a terrific goal of either passive house or net zero or both combined. But you really have to analyze your goal to begin with, and one is a little bit more of an individual goal. So, and I'm going to generalize here, but the net zero is a little bit more of an individual goal because we have to define the building for the individual end user. When we're talking passive house, we're talking a little bit more the collective goal. So with passive house, we're delivering a building, a modeled building for some random user, and that is how we approach the project. It's an undefined user. Well, it's not undefined. It's defined by the average individual. It's defined by the average capacity and consumption levels. Whereas when we're talking net zero, we're interviewing that client, we're talking to that client, we're determining exactly what they want to do in that building. Now, we may use passive house as a tool to get to a net zero goal, but if we're talking about a certified passive house, so one that's going to have a stamp and be a certified passive house, that is going to be certified to an average user, not the specific individual. So, what does the individual want? When you're interviewing them, we need what is their goal? What are the varying goals that they may be interested in? Well, there's just personal energy use impact. Maybe they're talking about low energy bills. Maybe they just want to be a demonstration project and really show the world what can happen in their project. Politics of energy. This is a really big one for me. And when we have a net zero building, we're demonstrating that this project, this building can produce as much energy as it consumes. How fantastic is that? And we can essentially state to the world, we understand the complexities and the complications of the energy politics, and we can remove this project from that to a certain degree. Then there's just personal commitment. Maybe you're interested in the property value. There's a lot of different potential goals that are going to inform the individual, and it's just a question. So that's what you need to interview them. You need to work with that specific project and determine why they want to get to either net zero or passive house. Now the collective goal, what's the collective goal? To me, it's that. It's the globe. It's the world. The collective goal so that's the sun rising across the globe as seen from the space station. That's the tiny little thin layer that we all live in. And so that's what we as a society, we as a species are mucking up a little bit in our current process. And how are we doing that? Predominantly by carbon emissions. So the collective goal is potentially more going to draw us towards a passive house level, because it's not just about the individual usage in the project. It's more about the passive house. The passive house specifics are talking about a building in how it's operated within the society. So it gets a little bit of a fine line, and there's many situations where they overlap one another, but that's the crux of it. And so in the collective aspect, this is what we're looking at. Buildings are a big part of this problem of all of that carbon emissions, all of that aspect. Buildings are 40+%, almost 50% of total carbon emissions in the United States on an annual basis, currently and historically. And where is that coming from? Well, so buildings are part of the problem, so we are a part of the solution, and passive house and net zero are absolutely critical for delivering that solution. And how is it? It's because it's almost exactly corresponds 48% versus 45%, carbon emissions versus energy production, energy consumption. So when we drop out our energy puzzle, we're dropping down our carbon emissions as an industry. And lots of folks recognize this. This is King County. King County's Strategic Climate Action Plan. Our municipality, not just the city, not any individual city, the whole county has developed a climate action plan. And this portion up here is what is happening, emissions, generally what's going to happen in society. So what do we need to do as a regional entity to drop it to the goal that in 2030, how many years is that? 13 years out. We have to drop this much, 50% in 13 years. It's a very aggressive plan. It's one of the best plans I've seen in the entire United States. So kudos to the folks at King County who've put that together, and it's up to us to implement it. It's up to us in this room and our building industry to implement it. And how are they going to implement it? Right there, 45% of it is from building energy reduction and increased renewable electricity, and a little bit of more natural gas than coal. But predominantly, it's going to be from building efficiencies and renewable production. That's what we're talking about tonight. So King County's got their finger on the goal. So what are we doing? We're drawing lines in the sand. We're giving ourselves some goals. And that's a tremendous thing that both Net Zero and Passive House do, is they give us a line in the sand and they say, your building needs to perform this well. It's a goal for us. And there's a number of tools and aspects we can get to it, and these guys are going to talk about their projects and how they've delivered, how they've met this line in the sand. And I'll go into a little bit more, but there's a few other aspects for net zero goals. There are other terms you might hear out there. One is a zero energy building. Another one is net zero or zero net energy. The Europeans call it ZNE. And net zero site energy. And I want to get into this thing. There's a difference between site energy use and source energy use. So there's two: net zero site, net zero source. And that's super critical. When we're talking about the collective and the commons, we're talking about source energy. When we're talking about the individual, we're talking about site. So site energy is how fast your meter spins. Source energy is how much society needs to extract, deliver, burn, transmit to get your toaster to work. So source is a much more complex number than just the utility meter spinning. And when we look at it from a collective and societal basis, it's actually even more important than site basis. So Passive House takes the step back by definition and looks at source energy. It's one of the critical lines in the sand, is saying your source energy is as important as your site energy. So whereas most net zero projects are looking exclusively at how fast the meter's spinning. So then there's another one, which is a zero emissions building. Now that's a pretty cool one. And there's another one which I really like, is a zero net carbon. And who here is part of the Architecture 2030 or goes to Architecture 2030 events? They have adopted the zero net carbon capacity. So we'll be seeing that more and more. So Passive House is a tremendous goal. Net zero energy is a tremendous goal. As we move forward within our building community, we'll be looking more and more at zero net carbon. So mostly your goal is going to be the meter spinning and making sure your consumption meter is at a negative number, and your production meter is meeting that. That's what we're looking at on an annual basis. Net zero is generally net on the site, making sure you're producing on an annual basis more than you're consuming. But society still is delivering energy to your building when you're not producing enough. So another aspect we want to make sure of is, what are you using? What's included in that number, in your site number? So there's a lot of external uses, and how are we incorporating them? So transportation. Is transportation included? Wow, that is a big number, right? And I'll show you a project later that we were able to include it in it. Food production, consumables, generally water. Who here has a pump, a well pump? Anybody in the room have a well pump? We got one well pump in the room. He has to have, if he's doing a net zero building, he's got to account for his well pump. Everybody else in here gets to use the city water and doesn't have to account for it. Right? So when we're looking at net zero, let's understand what we're including and what we're defining with it. And then sewer, same thing with sewer. So there's a lot of potential other aspects. And it really gets down to, when we're talking net zero buildings, here's the Hoovervilles in Seattle. I'm seeing a little bit more of that these days, similar stuff. Okay, are these folks here, they're not using a lot of energy. Their utility meter's not spinning fast. I like to call it, rather than a net zero building, it's a net zero occupant. Because my grandmother came out of the Depression, she used very little energy, right? Her furnace was not on. Her level of consumption was tremendously low, even in a standard building. So even the most efficient building can be run wildly out of whack by an inefficient user. So in the end, it's not necessarily a net zero building, it's a net zero occupant. And it's a lot easier to get to annual net zero with an efficient building. It is possible to get to annual net zero with an inefficient building if you have enough PV production and an efficient user. But when we're talking about really doing this and getting the deliverables, we want to build our buildings so that people don't have to wear a hair shirt to get to a net zero capacity. That's what we're looking for, right? So in general, what are the numbers? Per person residential use only, over 4,000 kilowatt hours per year. That's what our buildings are consuming. And for Washington State, it's even more. We need the lights on more, we need a little bit more heat than the average people. And we've got really cheap electricity, right? Add those things up. Here in Washington State, we consume about 5% more than than average across the country. But then if you add in all uses, it doubles. Transportation, and all those other parts and pieces. So when we're talking net zero, I want to encourage everybody, don't stop at zero. Don't stop at the zero-sum game. Make it a positive. So when you look at your building, you can be positive. You can try to meet these other needs with your building as long as you build a really efficient building and include as much production as possible. So that's what I'm just saying right now, that I like to, in a certain level, certain aspect, decouple them. I want to build as efficient building as I can and just produce as much energy as I can. And does it matter if it's on the roof or if it's in the windmills out in the Columbia River? Does the electron care? No, the electron doesn't care. So for me, it's most important to have the building be as efficient as economically feasible. So that's why I've leaned more towards passive house, with the caveat that net zero is a terrific additional goal. And those are my lines in the sand. So passive house, conservation and production, these two aspects. And this is the curve that was developed by the Passive House Institute US in 2015, a few years ago, where they analyzed and said this is our average consumption level. Here is where most net zero buildings or DOE or the Build America program says to stop. Well, if we squeeze a little bit more efficiency out for not much more investment, we can really drive it even lower. We can drive our energy savings even lower. And then we have that much less that we need to produce. So then to get down to a zero energy building needed a lot more investment. This is 2015. Who here installed PV in 2015? Anybody? Do you wish you did in 2017?
No.
No? Yes, you got the production.
Yeah.
The cost probably, it's definitely higher. So this curve is going down because the PV costs are coming down and down and down. So that's actually going to affect where the point number 3 is. So within the passive house community, look for an adjustment within the passive house standard from FIAS for adapting the level of how efficient the building needs to be. So when we look at production, what are we looking at production? Wow, we're way up here in the corner. We've got the worst solar exposure in the entire country. If you put PV panels in Southern California, you can double your production of the same panel as you put it in Seattle, Washington. So does the electron care if it's consumed here? If it goes across the wire? A little bit because of transmission losses. But within that, within the politics of energy and the use of energy, it's a little bit of a mixture about where but we have a hurdle here that our PV panels do not produce as much. So in general, we're at $3 to $4 per watt for a system. 8 to 10 watt capacity per square foot of your roof. You can do the math. How much do I need to meet that 4,000 kilowatt hours per year? Generally, a shady site will have 50 to 60% production. You can do the math. That's what we do. We go back and we crunch the numbers and we say, my system in this dark corner of the world will produce this amount, and that's how big a system I need. Okay? And then for residential usage only, average households about 4,000 kilowatt hours per year. It's good, you know, without a hair shirt on. Efficient households are down to about 3,000. Passive house, we're driving it down to 2,000 kilowatt hours per year, per person. That's average. That's an approximation. 2,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. So that's your PV system for a 4-person household. Now it needs to produce about 8,000 kilowatt hours per year. It's pretty straightforward math. You go back to this equation and figure out how big it needs to be. And if you build a really inefficient building, not like the Bullitt Center, you end up needing to have a tremendous amount of PV. But instead, if you do the work and so you can downsize your system, you can get it to appropriately sized to the building, even with a high energy use, intensity like a commercial space. So if you work and you conserve, if you reduce your consumption, then you can meet it with your production more easily. That's the crux behind aspect of net zero and passive house as a great team, is we reduce the consumption significantly so we can meet that goal of net zero, site net zero. So one thing I do want to comment though, how am I doing on the slides? Okay, I'm getting there. I'll get there. We get over here into utility PV, it's less than $2 a watt around the country. When we're looking at residential, it's double that. And then when we're looking at Washington State, it's even more because we don't have as advanced an industry as the other parts of our country. So, but one thing I do want to talk about is PV is replaceable. It degrades. It's a mechanical system. It's like your furnace. It's like your refrigerator. It is a system that's bolted onto the building. So what I want to be very aware of is that architectural solutions can be more long-lived. So when you build a building, when do you want to alter the form of the building, the shape of the building, the walls of the building, the roof of the building? Hopefully never while you live in it. Right? So whereas we may be altering our panels, we may be altering that mechanical system we bolted onto the building, but when we look at the structure of the building, we frequently want to leave it built for the generations, especially the form of the building. So that's another aspect where I emphasize the passive parts of this, is that we're looking at passive solutions from architectural and construction methodologies to drop that energy, and then we can alter our mechanical systems through the ages as it's readily adaptable. So how the heck do we do this? We use a lot of cool tools. I like to do a lot of work on the front end and model the building and optimize it and say, hey, if we did this, if we did that, we could lower our energy bills by this much. And we look at general consumption levels. There's a lot of great work done by Ecotope and NIA, survey around the Northwest about consumption levels. And we look at the big pieces and we hit them hard. And most of these are from the envelope and the domestic hot water system. So we hit those as hard as we can. And generally, these are the projects I've been working on of late, where my single family projects, the floor systems, these are some assembly values, R15 to R30, walls, R35, 40, roof 40 to 60. It's not crazy. We've learned a lot in the past 6-7 years. We don't have to go so far because we've learned how to adapt the systems. We're using very good windows still, very good ventilation, good air tightness. When we're getting up to the multifamily, I work in a multifamily building, it is code levels of insulation, straight up. Passive house levels. It's never going to be net zero until they really figure out a whole new way to produce energy, because it's so many occupants in such a small space and there's nowhere to put a lot of renewables on the building. But it can be passive house. And with code levels of insulation, better systems, better implements, better included. Then we also really have to work on the building systems that go into the building. Appliances, got to make sure they're top level appliances, make sure your lighting's all good. Making sure your heating and cooling systems are as efficient. We're looking for top level efficient for all our mechanical systems, right? Can you skimp on one or another? Quite possibly, but that's where the optimization comes in. And then domestic hot water is a huge thing. Look to something called EPA Water Sense. They have a tremendous program. There's another great guy named Gary Klein. He's got a lot of really good information. But tools, there's a lot of really good tools, and the tools will help you optimize your building. And there's a lot of good energy models. But one I also want to emphasize is to get the building to work effectively, you need to analyze it after you build it, after you move into it, because you can have a really efficient occupant, but one of those systems might not be working effectively. And if you don't look at it, if you don't monitor it, you may have something broken. And this building here, we had a tremendous energy user, and it was that induction stove. It was pulling a constant draw of 70 watts. It was the brain in the thing. It was using more than the entire laundry system. It was using almost as much energy as the domestic hot water system. All right, and then here's a few projects. Net Positive, single family, 10 kilowatt array, 9.6 kilowatt array, 4 family of 4. Both of these are bigger houses. And with that, there's a lot of great goals. Is it your individual? Is it what you're shooting for? Is it what we as a collective are shooting for? Use both of these tools, both of these methodologies to get to that great system. And one last thing I want to plug is the 12th Annual North American Passive House Conference is actually going to be in Seattle. This is an organization I work with, so with that caveat, end of September, downtown Seattle. It's a tremendous event, really fantastic event, and it'll be going to focus on path to net zero in all our buildings. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, we build all net zero energy buildings. We've just started trying to do predominantly net positive buildings. So every building we build makes all its own power and will also power an electric car. That's a big goal of. Oh, look, we have some sponsors on there, and a little picture of my place with some kids in the background. I do a lot of outdoor living, so I focus on some outdoor living spaces as well. So we did a couple projects in North Seattle where we did 2 projects side by side where the developer wanted to do net positive houses to sell. And so we're trying to prove how cost-effective net zero building could be. We ended up around 175 a square foot, and most of our techniques are fairly straightforward. We try to keep it simple. We don't use complicated wall assemblies. We stick to SIPS panel wall assembly. So you can kind of see the difference. If you guys aren't familiar with SIPS, it's like an ice cream sandwich. It's got like OSB on the outside and styrofoam on the inside. And you can frame entire houses with it. So that's like a typical wall detail for a SIPS floor and wall assembly. And then those are some other, fancier, thicker walls that people have worked on. One of the advantages of SIPS is that you get great air sealing. Another advantage is that you get a thinner wall. And so we're building like an R29 wall with a 6-inch wall, which in the city where you're on tight properties, that becomes a pretty big deal. That was our team there for that project. We tend to be a pretty tight crew. We work together. We spend 3 days a week on site, and then usually a day planning, because working construction, you kind of get tired after putting in too many hours bending nails. So another component of our process is the air-to-water heat pump. So typically we'll do all our heating and hot water with some version of chiller. This one's a Thermomatrix. We're currently using a Chiltrix, which is about as cost-effective as your regular heating system or a gas boiler or something like that, but has a coefficient of performance of about 4. So it's about 4 times as efficient as your typical heating and hot water system. So we're able to drastically reduce the amount of energy we need to heat and our hot water usage, which are the major components of the energy use of the building. So this is a HERS rating for that house, just barely below net zero, but depending on the occupant, could also power an electric car. Like with my personal house, we were at about a -13, and we powered 2 electric cars and a hot tub in the building, just because our occupant use is pretty low. And I think with the 10 kilowatt PV system, we have 4 adults and 4 kids all using hot water. So that heat pump, became essential to producing hot water to get those kind of to that kind of level. That looks like a lot of complicated stuff. We try not to do that. We do quite a bit of energy modeling, but we, again, keep it pretty simple and figure out, well, how do we get from point A to point B as cost effective and efficiently as possible? Because efficiency isn't just in how much energy your building uses, but it's also how complicated it is to build, how long it takes to build. Our last house we built in 4 months, start to finish, and that was from breaking ground to the customer moving in, so these places sold in about 6 days after we finished them, for substantially more than the $175 a square foot, because the guy that hired us wanted to make money as well, but that was our building cost. This is another component of, for me at least, another component of a net zero house is a house that can power your car, because I decided a couple of years ago that I didn't want to buy gasoline anymore, and so I don't want to buy power from the grid, and I don't want to buy gas. So having an electric car that would just plug into the house, I plug it in when I get home, I drive around, and the house powers the car. So, and that my other goal is to do nothing for the environment, and that's part of my. If I can do absolutely nothing, then I'm taking a step beyond my forefathers. So, and that's about all I got. Until question time, if anyone has any questions. So.
Okay. Just to say a little bit about myself, I started in passive solar back in the 70s, was very enthused about it, spent a fair amount of time trying to figure it out. Ultimately decided it probably wasn't the route to take, and so I went away from the energy world and went into more of the multifamily, looking for ways of doing dense urban housing that would be walkable communities and so on and so forth. So I spent most of my career doing housing projects that are urban, and only in 2009, during the downturn in the economy, discovered that there was a new approach to doing low energy buildings, which was passive house. And so I got myself trained in the class with Dan and have been promoting and pushing for that ever since. And recently, in terms of being part of the Passive House Northwest organization, we've really tried to link up with the net zero world in particular, and looking at an alignment of our goals, much as Dan was talking about. And what I wanted to do is at least mention here that Architecture 2030, the New Buildings Institute, and Rocky Mountain Institute all have published a white paper describing what they say is the zero net carbon approach that they recommend to get to the 2030 challenge. And they described what an appropriate building would be, which is a highly energy efficient building that produces on site or procures enough carbon-free and renewable energy to meet building operations energy consumption annually. So they've created this definition that they have shared amongst themselves, that they have now negotiated and found acceptable to other green organizations around the world. It's sort of this common language of what we're talking about when we talk about the goals we're trying to achieve. So one of the things that Passive House Northwest and NK Architecture is really pursuing now is how to get a high performance energy building energy coalition that aligns all of our green organizations toward this common goal, toward which we can get the state, the city, funders to recognize the value of it and really target that. So it's this definition that we think is key for a shared purpose. And part of that is that it's efficiency first. And that's what Dan was talking about in terms of the steps to net zero. And what Ted Clifton was defining was really a efficiency first building to get to that net zero. So no matter whether the building is on-site net zero or procuring through net zero to get to net zero, efficiency first is what my target has been. And so I'll show you a few things that we've been working on over the last few years. So we have worked on Park Passive, which is a single family house here in Seattle that's done by Cascade Built. There's also a townhouse called View House 5 that was a certified passive house. And we're now working on a multifamily apartment building in Columbia City that will start in a month or so. Construction will be a 35-unit passive house apartment building, which is the courtyard you see in the middle. We have a branch office in Pittsburgh in which we have a Carnegie Library, a new build. We have a senior affordable housing building which involves retrofit of an old masonry school, as well as a new addition that would all be passive house. So we have a variety of things going on, just so you know that the market's pretty wide and it's starting to take off dramatically in New York, Pennsylvania, and especially in Vancouver, BC. So we're sort of behind the curve here, even though we have probably a dozen or two passive houses in Seattle. So just to walk you through some of the ideas here that we get involved in, I have a range of different wall assemblies here, so you can see sort of different ways of doing things. On the right is a very common solution, which is a standard 2x6 framed wall with some type of thick insulation on the outside. And that was more or less the design that was used for the View House 5 project. In Pittsburgh, we're retrofitting a masonry building where most of the insulation is all happening on the interior. So we're using a special type of blown-in insulation that has a very low carbon potential. And so that's really our retrofit solution. And then the current project in Columbia City is following Ted Clifton's idea of using SIPS panels. So we're using, again, a 2x6 SIPS panel as the enclosure for that project and achieving passive house performance. And this is the project in Columbia City on what is essentially a single family lot that's been zoned now for multifamily. And some of the features about this that I want to point out are the fact that it has a mostly west-facing exposure. So given that as a market rate project, people in these relatively small units want lots of glass, we have to deal with the solar exposure of the west-facing sun. So we have operable wood panels on the west side that puts it in the hands of the occupant to manage the solar gain in the building. On the south side, we use overhangs to control the summertime gain. We also originally were targeting being a net zero building. But in order to do that, we took the calculation of finding the absolute best solar panels you can buy, sun power, and seeing what they could produce, see if there's enough roof area to make that a net zero building. And the concept was if you had an EUI of 18 on each of your 4 floors, and you covered the entire roof with the best panels you could get a net zero building. So 20 is about the maximum you can get today from sun power panel on a square foot basis, 20 kilowatt hours. And the 17 EUI of the building operation itself would be 1/4 of that. So that would give you a net zero building under ideal circumstances. So this is what it would have looked like. We'd have had to cover the entire roof, and it was decided that the cost of going that route for an elevated panel was too much, and the city said, we don't like the look of it, so too bad. So the plan eventually is to install roof-mounted panels, which would get you about 60% of the way there. So you might get 3 stories of net zero and 1 story that's not, just to give you an idea of what's feasible today in a urban environment for going toward net zero. In this particular case, we had a ground floor that involved some retail, 10 units per floor above, an open court and open walkway on the east side. And one of the sort of new concepts we're trying to pursue here is how to make the ventilation system as efficient as possible. And efficiency not just in terms of how it performs, but how you get the most value out of each piece of the system. So we decided to go with a distributed ventilation system where you see, in this case, originally there was 2 HRVs per floor, each one serving 5 units. And it would be a house-sized ventilator serving 5 units. Now you have 1/5 of the cost of the unit being shared by 5 units. This was the ultimate layout that we ended up using, which is 6 units per floor, as you see them up there, on those floors, and then split 2 and 4 on the other end of the building. So we still had a distributed system that, again, I think all things working out, that'll be started construction in the next month or so. So we think that's a great way to go because it brings the cost down of making a high-performance ventilation system in the range of about $1,000 per unit, which is substantially better than your typical house-sized per unit basis. This is a picture of the courtyard. We also looked extensively at how this slab-on-grade building sits on the ground and looked at different ways of achieving a very efficient thermal envelope at the ground. And if you look on the right here, you'll see 2 different types of exterior foundation, one that has the stem coming up to the panel and one that has the insulation going across. So on this particular building, what we tried to do was allow the SIPS panels to be simply a cladding on the exterior of the structure, so that we're moving the structure slightly to the interior and letting the panel be on the outside. So by the fact that over here, this wall was not structural, we were able to extend the insulation through and let that insulation wrap through the corner and make it a much more efficient condition. That's one of the things we're sort of looking at, how to make these things work more efficiently in a simple, less expensive solution. And this is an example of the therm modeling of a couple of different conditions that really help achieve that goal. Then take us back to the first house that NK did in Seattle here, which was Park Passive, and some of the people who are enjoying the comfort and health and fresh air of living in a passive house. So that's pretty much what I wanted to offer, and open to questions to follow up on.
Great. Thank you, Joe. So now we're going to have Lucas come up and lead us in a moderated discussion on the pros and cons.
You're taller than me. Well, thank you guys for being here, and those were wonderful presentations. Before we get started with presentations, I just wanted to say kind of a quick thing about me feeling finally hopeful in my career. I got started in this space. I started as a scientist, then I was a custom home builder for a long time. And when I was in my undergrad program, I was doing physicochemical biology, and I worked in a chemical oceanography lab, right? And we were studying ocean acidification. For me, that's actually the more terrifying part about increased CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Climate change is scary, bad, not good, obviously. But ocean acidification is really what got me worried to the point where I had to drop out of my career as a scientist and get into doing something about it. It's a really simple mechanism as well. Increased CO2 in the atmosphere interfaces with seawater, becomes carbonic acid, right? Carbonic acid lowers the pH of oceans. As the ocean pH lowers, it makes it really hard for these things called phytoplankton to survive. Why is that a big deal? Well, phytoplankton provides 70% of the oxygen on this planet, as well as being the basis of pretty much all marine life. The lab I was working in was saying that the results we were discovering were indicating that phytoplankton would have a pretty hard time surviving by about 2050. And that's kind of a game over scenario. That's 70% of our oxygen gone. For a long time, working on one project at a time or whatnot, I didn't feel like we were going to be able to do something. I mean, I was trying to do something about it, but like I didn't feel like societally we were going to pull this off. But at the scale that I work now, which is all of North America, we're starting to see such an emergence in popularity of passive house, net zero, and other technologies like that. And for the first time, I actually feel really hopeful that we might pull this off. Seattle, Portland have been doing a great job, but in particular Vancouver, as you mentioned. I just got back from there, literally just drove there from some meetings I had today to this event. And yeah, I mean, they're looking at having passive house be base code by 2020. That's amazing, right? The other side of things, though, is if we do passive house with materials that have high embodied energy that are very toxic, we might not achieve the goal that we're actually going for, right? Which is to fight climate change, ocean acidification, whatever it is. So we need to think about that side of things. I prepared a few questions. Brian and I had talked through this a little bit, but more interested really in grabbing your guys' questions. So basically, if anyone has anything immediate, let's get started with that. And if, it's kind of awkward to start questions sometimes. So if you don't want to ask the first question, I'm happy to do it. So, okay.
I got one, an easy one for Joe and Ted. Are your projects going to be on the tour this weekend?
Yes, I have a project in Columbia City on the tour. It's one we're almost finished with. It uses all the techniques that we typically put in a net zero house.
And are you
And
Saturday?
sorry, excuse me. Can people hear in the back of the room with? Can we use the mic?
Yeah, we're on the tour on Saturday in Columbia City and using all the techniques that we typically use in a net zero house, and we'll also have an electric car plugged in and be able to show it off.
That's awesome.
We do not have anything available currently to be shown.
And if anyone in the back of the room can't hear the question being asked or anything like that, just let me know and I'll repeat the question back on the microphone. George.
What about Dan? Does Dan have any projects to offer?
Oh, Dan.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
There's the one in Wallingford. Wallingford,
What?
what happened? There's one in Wallingford that Whitney Architecture Design Hammer and Hand built that I was consulting. On Sunday.
Was that the one, was that shown last year?
Yes.
The one with the awesome top deck? Yeah. Good. It's a great house.
And George, I think you had a question.
So, question for Joe on the Hudson project. Why would the city not let you do a big PV array when the Mullen Center has an enormous one over it?
Apparently they think the design criteria have changed. I think there's a replacement need in the design review department.
Yes.
You referred a couple times to the zero carbon plan. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Architecture 2030 has evolved their program where it was announced, I think in January of this year, that net zero carbon is their target for 2030. And that means taking into account all these other things around energy that relate to carbon, not specifically just energy. So as Dan was saying, there is production of energy off-site that's contributing carbon to the system. Even if you have a net zero site, you may not use a net zero carbon.
And another impressive thing I just learned about in BC is the province has now adopted is in the process of adopting the 2030 net zero carbon goals for the whole province, which is, I mean, just amazing.
Another element, the net zero carbon is an element of the Paris Accords. Is that not just looking at the building for net zero energy, but actually looking at the carbon of going into the energy that is then utilized in the building. So that's a part of the Paris Accords.
Absolutely. Yes.
What about the carbon involved in the construction materials to begin with?
Super important, super important. And if we tear down every poorly efficient building and build a new one, it's going to spike our carbon high. So it's very clear, it's very important. There are strategies to deliver low carbon buildings, and they're very important to integrate. One of the beauties, I think, in the evolution at this point is that the buildings we're building, the carbon footprint of that building is so incrementally different from a construction standpoint of the one next door.
Yep.
And just because we don't need that much more work, we just need it to be more comprehensively installed. And so the first passive house projects I did utilize a lot more elements in the building, but we're able to ramp. We've improved our practice now over the past decade that it's integratable without too much effort.
And the flip side of that is also the durability of the building, right? If we build a passive house that lasts for 10 years, that's not going to be a very great solution. So do you guys have anything to add as far as that, the durability side of the high performance buildings?
It's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And it's actually even more critical because the buildings, historically, our buildings have utilized a lot of energy, and the energy utilized within the building has been able to manage a lot of the potential damaging capacities. So our older buildings have essentially had kilns or dryers integrated into their systems. So our furnaces have been going in a lot of parts of the country, especially humid places, that the air conditioners have been going. So our buildings, the most damaging aspect to our buildings in general is moisture, and our mechanical systems have been pulling that moisture out of the building. Now we're building buildings where we're dropping that energy consumption low. We're turning off the furnaces. We're using a hair dryer instead of a jet engine. And so now the buildings need a little bit more integrated immune systems. So we need to be very careful about how we build them so that they can manage this concern.
I got something to add to that.
Sure.
That durability is very important. I totally agree. And then also, like, moisture is a huge thing. So reducing the, like with an HRD, something that can constantly ventilate the structure. But then also we look at things like in the durability realm of building a building that doesn't require a lot of maintenance, because a building that's constantly, needs someone to recaulk and repaint, and a lot of those things, if they don't get done, then you might build this great building that just kind of falls apart. And so we're trying to use more just simple, durable materials. I mean, things like fiber cement board that, when you clad the outside of a building in fiber cement board, it lasts a lot longer. It doesn't need repainted as much. So.
Exactly. And kind of the optimized way to do it, of course, is minimize embodied energy, the, embedded carbon in the material you're doing and up front, and then make that last for a really long time, right? That's the ultimate goal is, yeah. There's a lot of passive houses that are built that I'm honestly not that impressed by because they probably aren't going to last that long. John, you had your hand up first.
Sure. How is, in the net zero carbon standard, how is offsite procurement of non-carbon energy handled? We had a meeting here last year, in fact, just a year ago, about community solar, and the thing that my takeaway on that is in most cases, community solar is more cost effective than individual solar on a building. And so when you're trying to do net zero on your building there, rather than going with really expensive solar, if there's a way of investing in it that works mechanically and reliably, that might be the most cost-effective way to solve the problem.
So when I last heard folks from Architecture 2030 speaking about that issue, they've come to recognize the fact that most buildings in urban areas will never be net zero on the site anyway. So that procuring it off-site as a dedicated building-specific production is really the future way of looking at it. You're right. So I think production in locations that are not necessarily on the site are a very viable and necessary way of going.
Have they established specific standards to evaluate whether that's acceptable?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Do you guys know if either of you know if like PSE's green power program, when you sign up for that, are you getting renewable power and then like Arcadia Power,
Sort of.
party? Does anyone,
I used to help manage these programs when I first moved to the city of Seattle.
How.
I used to help manage Seattle City Lights and PSE's rebate programs and energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. And it's a lot better than other areas, but it's by no means perfect. Because the electrons don't really care where they come from. Like if you sign up for Green Power program, what it does is help incentivize more renewable generation. It's not like all of a sudden you have green electrons coming to your building. They might be coming from a coal plant. No one knows really where the electron's actually coming from, unless it's coming from your own roof or something. Then you know where it's coming from.
And frequently, a lot of times, if it's coming from your roof, it's sometimes going out before it even comes back. So it's not even necessarily going into your building.
That's the whole net zero thing, right? Is that you're putting energy onto the grid, and you might be getting coal energy back, but you're putting renewable energy onto the grid to offset that energy use.
So it's my understanding that the net zero carbon is that it's looking at the building and its use and making sure that new renewable infrastructure is created to added to the grid to account for the use of the building. Just as a net zero building is adding that capacity to the grid, as long as it's a grid tied system. So it's the same thing that the solar panels in Ellensburg kick out 25% more than they do in Seattle. Boom, just because they get more sunshine. The wind energy is significantly less expensive than PV energy from a carbon input from the front end as well as production. So there's a lot of it opens up a world, I think, to our building, the built infrastructure, that we can look to coordinate our efforts with the renewable energy systems across the country, and not just have to think about our own building.
And again, on the note of having hope for the first time in my career, guess what? Solar is below parity. That means that it's cheaper to build than fossil fuel resources. So the green power programs, which were fantastic because they basically paid for the incremental cost of doing renewables, they don't really need to exist anymore because solar is now cheaper. Up front, period. So that's a really, really, really good thing. And part of how solar got cheaper up front is because of these green power purchase programs that we built enough of it. So passive house right now, 5% more than conventional sometimes, could be 50%, kind of depends on finishes more than the actual envelope, because the envelope's a small percentage of the budget, right? But as we build more and more passive houses, there's no reason passive house can't be cost competitive with conventional up front. We just need to build more of them. I don't know, that's probably up for debate, but that's my firm opinion, but we can share that one. Yes?
Other than PV, is there any other source of production of energy for the house, or putting a giant windmill in your yard? Is there any other way to produce energy?
So when we look at building energy, uses of energy in the building, one of the biggest ones, if we're looking at residential, is hot water. And so the coefficient of performance of systems is, okay, how much energy do you put in versus how much energy do you get out? Solar thermal systems, solar hot water systems can be coefficient performance of 30, 40, or 50. So there's still some pumps involved, et cetera. So they can be tremendously effective. That said, you have to combine them with another system for a single-family residential. And so when you do that, it's become less cost-effective. Now you need 2 water heaters and so on and so forth. So the coefficient performance drops, especially in Seattle, because you need the hot water in December just as much as you need it in July. So historically, that's been another place we've looked. However, in single-family residential, it's mostly fallen off the table. It's still going in multifamily, and the Hudson project still may have it incorporated. So that's the main things. Around here, if anybody's building in a rural location or some urban locations, micro hydro has tremendous capacities. So by all means, look to whatever you have available on site. If you've got good wind, use the wind, but there's not a lot of wind here. If you've got good hydro capacities, it's fantastic. And it's a lot of return for the investment and very low maintenance.
Go ahead.
Something little to add to that. So I monitored our systems with NEA, the Northwest Energy Alliance, and we had solar thermal, solar hydronic and photovoltaic systems, and our heat pump that was a Daikin thermo on that house. And we had NEA crunch the numbers, and so they figured out, and then we compared how efficient the systems were, how much hot water we got out of the solar hot water, and how much hot water we got out of the heat pump that was powered by the photovoltaics. And they ended up being almost identical.
Interesting.
In for the cost of the installed system. So we looked at how many dollars per, thermal unit of hot water, and they ended up being really close. And so, depending on whether you need hot water more, what time of year, probably ends up making a huge difference. Like if you're heating a pool in the summertime, solar thermal would totally be the way to go, which I haven't done yet, but it'd be cool to have a net zero house with a pool.
UC Santa Barbara, I went to grad school. That was a project I was working on. We were doing kind of trying to do a net zero energy retrofit of the whole campus, and solar thermal is by easily the only way to do a pool, right? Because you need that coefficient of performance with limited roof space. Joe, did you have anything else to add to that?
No.
I saw one thing really cool the other day. They're called wind trees, and they work in really low wind environments like we experience in Seattle, and they basically look like a tree art installation, and the leaves can come in different colors, but the little leaves spin and create a microcurrent that all kind of adds up, and probably enough output, like 1 to 3 kilowatt capacity, is reasonable for, if your roof doesn't have enough room for solar, and frankly, they just look kind of cool. I don't know if you can get them in North America, they're from Germany, but anyway, you had a question.
So, my question is from the point of view of a person who may want to own a passive house.
Mm-hmm.
So, the first question that comes to mind is the cost.
Sure.
So, how much more costlier is a passive home than a regular home, and then how soon can the cost even out with all the less energy that we are using, especially because in Seattle, we know that the solar panels are not going to be of much use, especially for single-family homes or something.
Sure, and yes, so it's just about the cost effectiveness of passive house. Basically, how much more does it cost up front? How long does it take to pay back that additional cost? And I mean, frankly, after a decade of being a home builder and doing passive house projects, it really comes down to more what you want for your finishes than what you're going to do for your envelope. That's where the budget changes, not your envelope. But on average, I don't know, you always want to address this one as far as additional cost and payback. I'd say probably not much more and very quick in general.
It's entirely variable with the size of the building, the type of building, so there's too many variables to really say.
Just let's say a regular 3,000 square foot of house, single family home, average, just a general comparison to get some idea.
A general comparison would be we're seeing cost premiums, so how much more would it cost? Somewhere between 5 and 15%.
Yeah,
so
that's reasonable.
There's so many parameters of where it will be within that. How long does it take to recapture that value from the lower energy bills? With 7 cents a kilowatt hour energy in the Pacific Northwest, it'll take a really long time. It's really, we have will it take forever? No. Will it take more? With the incentives we have for solar panels, solar PV, those from a straight up return on investment standpoint, those are probably a little bit better of an investment. So, but when we're looking at the passive house level, we're looking at the investment in the structure itself for generations. And we're looking at not only that, but we're looking at it's very hard to quantify quality of life inside these buildings, but they're quiet, they have really tremendous interior air quality, and you can sit in front of the windows and it's not cold in front of the windows on a winter's day. So there's a certain quality of life aspect, and is it worth shaving off a little bit of the building to increase that potentially? So.
And I would agree, it's incredibly complex, nuanced answer, but the company I worked for a while down in Olympia, Artisans Group, they're a design build firm that exclusively did passive house, and the president of the company, the founder, Randy, was a former banker, so he's a financier obsessed with spreadsheets and numbers, right? The average cost increase for passive house versus a custom home was 3%, and was 3.1%. I think he's a financier, so there's a lot of whatever percents. So it was 3.1%, and it usually paid back in less than 5 years or so, was kind of the average number that we were going with. And it depends. we have a code-built building with an R19 wall, but it's called R19 and it's modeled as R19, but the real-world performance of an R19 code-built wall is probably like R5. So it really will perform worse. So like when you just look at it at an energy model standpoint, it's kind of complex. So it's a really hard question to answer, but really I think with a fundamental thing you're asking, is it worth building a passive house? Yes, it's worth building a passive house.
Yeah, there you go.
Definitely worth.
Yes?
Where does the increased air quality come from? Why is that, what's that a result of?
That's probably from your ventilation system. I mean, typically, most of us are using some sort of 24-hour ventilation system, whether it's an HRV or another type of fan-based ventilation system that's always running. So you're always getting fresh air in the building. Because most of these buildings are very, very tight. So you want to control your air leakage so you're not just leaking heat out, but then also, doing a very good ventilation system.
And you very much can also open windows in a passive house. That's a common misperception that it's like a hermetically sealed envelope. No, but indoor air quality, if you're having it based upon windows being open, what's the outdoor air quality, right? And in a city, probably not very good. So sealing up the envelope so you can choose whether or not to have your windows open, but even when your windows are shut, you have filtered, consistent, high-quality air being put in there, and you've isolated yourself from what's going on outside. Anyone else want to?
I want to add to this whole question of cost effectiveness. If you only look at the energy side and not at the comfort and value side, it's challenging to say how the energy you're saving will pay for the system that you put in, right? Whether it's solar panels or it's energy efficiency. Largely, system-wide, it's because the people who are paying the bill are not the people who are investing the money in the building. For example, if you have a rental apartment, it's the renters who generally get the benefit of the lower expenses, but the builder has to put the money in. There's a lot of strange things in that arena. So valuing the energy correctly, the conservation, is something that has been pioneered by a program called the Meets Accelerator Coalition, and the program they put together for the Bullitt Center, where the Bullitt Center's conservation is being purchased by City Light like they were producing power. So they're getting paid on a very predictable basis the value of the energy over 20 years. So it's something I want people to be aware of, that there are things happening on that side of things where the utility becomes part of incentivizing high-performance building that will radically change the return picture on efficiency. It's not going to come to your house very soon, but it's happening in larger projects and larger buildings right now.
Yeah, and PG&E down in California, which is one of the world's largest utilities, is also starting to do that that same program as a pilot.
Great.
Yes. Yes. Sorry, add to that one.
I just want to briefly add to the cost thing, because what we found in building net zero houses is that most of our paybacks are 6 to 15 years for, if we go with a SIPS wall, we go with the heat pump, we do solar panels, but most of our customers are operating on a 30-year mortgage, and so if it pays back within 30 years, that means every single month your payment's lower. So going with a net zero energy house, our customers will have lower combined house and energy payments than someone that builds a regular house that's just cheaper.
Ted, you should mention, if you're charging a car and offsetting gas costs, that whole equation gets thrown off.
That's a really good point too.
Well, I drive like 30,000 miles a year, and I think if I didn't drive an electric car, I don't think I could justify my existence.
And another big difference is passive houses, people tend to actually want to live for 30 years because they're comfortable and healthy and all that. So you'll actually get to experience that payback in a passive house. Whereas, let's say it's a 6 to 15 year payback, most conventional houses I wouldn't want to spend 6 to 15 minutes living in. So it's worth it, is the point. You had a question, and then I think you had a question that you were waiting for. So
A real quick comment before my question. Just one other benefit in affordable housing. Sitting on Habitat's board, we talked a lot about developing passive house or highly energy efficient buildings, because once you get them built, the operational cost for low income people is very low.
very good point.
So
And he's mentioning the operational cost for low-income people is a lot lower in these high-performance buildings, and for low-income households, energy bills end up being maybe 30 to 50% of the overall living cost of their lives. So it's a very, very significant thing to save.
So when
Yes.
I started studying Passive House a while ago, one of the things that really made that delta expensive was where you're getting your windows from. Where are these tapes coming from?
Yeah.
All of these really cool materials, and they're all coming from Germany or, and so developing locally sourced products for Passive House to make it work is really a key element of lowering the cost to become more of the norm, the way we build. And I guess I'm just asking, how much locally sourced products that really meet the needs of Passive House are you seeing? Does that change?
So let me repeat the question back. Basically, the idea is that part of the expense of Passive House is a lot of the materials come from other markets that are way ahead of us, like Germany and Europe. And basically, how do we see any emergence of local resources for being able to achieve these? And the point I'd make on that is, first and foremost, those materials have to actually work, and then we should make them local, right? Because if they don't work, then it's pointless to use them.
So we do have this hurdle here that our building industry is down. It's bottom dollar, and it's not about health and welfare of the occupants. It's about return on investment for the. So that's such a driver that it's difficult to get higher quality materials within some systems. That said, I build an entirely different building now than I did 7 years ago. Not entirely, I guess I would say that. Not entirely, but even 7 years ago, the vast majority of the equipment in the building was domestic. And it's so much of it literally is just simple systems that are from the lumberyard. There are unique systems, Windows specific, and to get the higher performance ones, the North American window industry still hasn't fully developed. So it's a boutique industry here. So what we have done is we've greased the wheels for import from other markets, and there's even markets in Asia that are developing faster than in North America.
Absolutely.
And so shipping, yes, has a hurdle. Many of our window packages here in the Northwest come from Wisconsin or Minnesota.
Yep.
And there's a long lead time, and they put them on a semi and bring them out. And there's a giant carbon hit for that. So it actually takes less carbon, takes more planning to bring it in from Europe, but they have a mature industry. And so what we have been able to do is establish an avenue for low-cost, high-performance materials coming from Europe for these critical elements. Questionably, I want this stuff done here, and I'm still looking for somebody in our region. There's so many good engineers, mechanical engineers here. I want good mechanical systems built here locally. That's what that's the one thing that I really want to see happen.
Yeah, we started doing our own mechanical systems because not a lot of the guys are familiar with the heat pumps and things that we wanted to use, and so I mean, one neat local material though is the SIP panels that we use are made in Puyallup, and they're very low global warming potential, EPS foam, OSB, and our major building material here is wood, which most of it's local, even if it's not certified by some agency, which a lot of it is, but a lot of our wood comes locally. And then we have a couple good window manufacturers up just across the border in Canada that are Vinyltech and Euroclad are two that we've used.
And there's more and more every day. I mean, Cascadia, Glow Windows. I mean, if you go to a Passive House conference, probably 15 out of the 18 vendors there are window vendors. I mean, it's a very profitable part of Passive House too, so that's part of it. But windows are going to be eminently solved, and the rest of the stuff is catching up.
I think we're creating a market demand to buy importing windows from Europe that are 10% less expensive and 10% better than anything we can get here. We're kind of telling our local manufacturers, when they don't get that project, they're like, where are you getting your windows? And so we give them feedback and we say, hey, we can get a U value of 0.12 or 0.15, where yours is 0.2, for the same price. So
absolutely.
There is a Windows manufacturer of window systems in Ohio called DeCunic, and they're supplying extrusions to various window manufacturers around the country. One of which is in Chicago, Lindsay Windows, and they've recently opened up a showroom, I believe, on the east side, where you can get high performance passive house windows that are produced in the U.S. Their particular product, I think, is called the Revolution Tilt and Turn Window, and we're working with them to try to get their prices in line with what are European windows, but at least they're going to be locally sourced, relatively local, out of Chicago. But I understand they're building a plant now in Nevada as well.
Nice.
So.
Yeah, and I mean, that question hits the heart of what I do these days. I mean, what our company does at this point is import European building products to kind of leapfrog so we can do high performance, healthy, durable, low embodied energy passive house. But our goal as a company is to solve the climate crisis through high performance buildings, so we appreciate the irony of having these products shipped across the world to do it. But what we have to do is prove the demand here, build a lot more passive houses, and then we're actually scaling up so quickly now that our 10-year plan was start producing all this stuff in North America. That's looking like it's a 5-year plan. So all the tapes and membranes and ventilation systems and all that other stuff, we're in the process of trying to open factories to do that in America, bring some green jobs and production back to America, that kind of deal. We're actively trying to make that happen, but it's not an easy thing to do. So we're on the way.
And one other comment I want to make about, specifically with your comment about affordable housing, is that we live in Seattle, how many, we need, 50,000 housing units in the next 5 years? So that's not going to come from single family houses. It's going to come from multifamilies. And once we're getting into multifamily buildings, the efficiencies, not just in construction and occupation, but also from a building energy standpoint, are so much better that our envelope doesn't need to be what it is on a single family house. To get to such efficiency levels, literally it's a 45 unit building, 13th and Pike, I'm working on it right now. It's code level walls, code level floor, code level roof. The window is coming from Europe, but that's only because their price point is tremendous. It's only a double glazed window. So it's about half again as much as the simple, really foolishly inexpensive window, the disposable window that they put in all those multifamily buildings. So it's only half again as much as that, and it's working. It's been working.
And going back to that hopeful message, I mean, we're working on thousands of projects, literally thousands of projects all over North America, and one in particular comes to mind up in BC, of course, because that's where this stuff's really taking off. It's not built yet, but we just modeled this out. It's a low-income passive house for BC housing. It's a 100-unit multifamily, and it's going to be a certified passive house, and it looks like it's going to be the exact same cost up front as a conventional building would have been. So we're doing it. We're on the way. George.
Yeah, so I just, cost question always rankles me, and so I'm gonna comment instead of asking a question.
Cool.
And with respect to the person who asked it, when you think of median home price, that means that half the homes cost more and half the homes cost less than that. So if you have 100 homes, only one of them is a median priced home. Everyone else is different from the median. By the same token, there is no such thing as a typical house. It does not exist. And if you ask 17 people what a typical house is, you get 17 different answers. If you think about a car, right? What's a typical car? There's zillions of them out there. Some are high performance and expensive, some are high performance and inexpensive. Some are low performance and expensive, and some are low performance and inexpensive. We're talking about different things. It's apples and oranges. So to make some sort of a relative comparison to a fictional thing is a fiction.
Wow, I love that.
The more important question is, how much are these buildings costing? Ted's given one answer, Joe's working on a project that has another answer, Dan's working on projects that other. If you look at that, you get useful information. Comparing it to a fictional thing is pointless. Thank you.
Totally agreed there. That's awesome. And yes, I forgot you put your hand down, so I'm sorry, I forgot.
Yeah, just sort of, I guess, a little more basic question, but sort of, it's more on these design questions. So, some of it goes to cost, I guess. I think Dan knows Dan Colbert, who's pretty good house.
I love that one. Yeah.
Being the passive house.
Absolutely. So basic question is, retrofit versus new construction. We've been talking mostly on the new construction level, but how achievable is it? How difficult is it? My experience as a builder was doable, but maybe a little harder, depending on how deep the remodel's going.
Well, no, I'm also talking about how, it seems to me like that should be part of your design with a new passive house.
Oh, remodelability.
I also
Okay.
I've worked in yachts, boats for a long time. Boats, we build everything with panels that are removable and accessible. Most new builders, house builders, do a very poor job of that.
100%.
About opening things up and doing it, but you can build so it's easy to do, or you can build so it's very hard.
And most people think of a house as the finishes, right? And the finishes are the things that are trendy and change over time. So we should probably make, if a passive house is going to last, say, 200 years, we probably want to make it so you can change the finishes over time without tearing down the house, right?
Yeah, it's going to
Makes sense.
Period.
So I'd like to speak to that. And I have a typical design style that I work with, which is a rectangular box, but I fit all the different rooms you might need in. And I like to do like a post and beam line right down the middle, or somewhat offset sometimes. So that if anyone ever wants to remodel, the walls are just so much wallpaper. You can tear them out or move them around. The main structure of the house, the SIPS envelope, the posts and beams, those are inviolate. And then, if you ever want to add a bedroom, take away a bedroom, turn your dining room, like the houses we just built in Columbia City that you can go look at on Saturday, they have a dining room that could easily be your first floor, handicap accessible bedroom with a small remodel. And so, just looking at that when we design the house, because I'm not just building it for the person I'm building it for. I'm building it for the next 100 years of people that are going to live in it, and thinking about what can I do to make it easy for them to remodel without tearing apart my exterior walls that are, because really that's the part I don't want anyone messing with, is my envelope and the shape of the building and the look of the building, where making it so it's really easy to move around the interior stuff. Makes a lot of sense to me.
And Japan's a really good place to look for that. They've been doing that for a really, really, really long time. Sliding walls and stuff, right?
There was a program that came up in the 60s, I think in Denmark, about public housing, that it revolved around the concept that the building's enclosure is more of a social factor and a social investment, and the building's interior is a personal investment. And so we should collectively be incentivizing the enclosure that's going to be around for a much longer time, and then allow people to sort of customize their interior. So if you think about a shell and an interior being sort of two different systems, maybe.
That's really interesting.
And I'd like to bring this back to the durability comment that came up a while ago, is that durability is very much about how we adapt and work within our buildings over time. The maintenance issue, but also the alteration issue. And if we, I think one of the beauties that's happened is, as we're getting these high performance buildings and we've got common practice now, there's definitely a move towards integrating standard systems, so that when somebody does go and change it, it's not going to be a science experiment. It's not going to be, what on earth were they doing here? So it's really, rather than using unique practices, really honing back to using common standard things that people will recognize. I would like to make one other comment I just thought about it a moment ago regarding costs. And I will say a few aspects we've been dealing with on a couple of big multifamilies here, but it really does also come down to our single-family projects, general single-family projects, is here in the Northwest, we have this tremendous, especially Seattle, we have tremendous interest in doing this work. But the financial driver isn't there because we have very low energy costs. And also, despite the 150 days of rain we've just experienced, it's not that critical a climate. It's actually pretty hard to freeze to death here. Whereas you go to a lot of the United States, it's not too hard. I mean, you can get dive exposure. If your power goes out in your building, you're going to burst pipes in a day or three. Or you can get to a lot of parts of the country where it generally isn't even widely livable without air conditioning. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a fairly mild climate slice, which means that our buildings haven't had to deal with a heck of a lot. And who here has air conditioning in their house? Right?
Well, I have a heat pump, so
yeah. So we got right, but I grew up in Oklahoma. Like there were a few houses that still had no air conditioning in the 80s, but there weren't many. And so here in the Northwest, our systems have been very simple for mechanical systems. Our ventilation systems have been really about as bottom barrel as you can get to. You know, a timer on your range hood, like how more simple can you be? Like, so we have a hurdle to deliver better performing buildings because our standards are pretty low what we're comparing it to. So it's gonna be more, you're putting more investment in the structure to deliver a better building because you can get away with a worse building here than you can get away with it in other parts of the country.
And another really important point to that, I go around the West Coast giving lectures on this stuff all the time, and for this audience, energy efficiency matters, right? For a lot of audiences, energy efficiency doesn't matter. And this is part of what's so genius about that MEETS program, is that program that he was mentioning, basically let the tenants basically pay the same energy bill as they would have paid in an inefficient building, but they get the comfort and health side of it. And that's why most people do these things, is for the comfort and health. So what I like to say is comfort and health is the utility we're trying to deliver, and can we follow a scientifically proven approach to deliver comfort and health in buildings? And guess what, if you do that, you get pretty darn close to passive house. So you get the energy efficiency, you can kind of sneak it in there when you're just talking about comfort and health. The other side of it is, even like the cheapest developer in the world, ask them, do you want an uncomfortable, unhealthy building? No one's gonna say yes to that. So that makes the conversation, at least starting the conversation, a bit easier. There was other questions. Yes?
So the passive housing, we have multi-family housing, we have single-family housing, like on-site basically. And are there any existing factory operations where they do manufactured homes that do a certain certification so that it's just out of the box thing that you can just put it in a rural area that you can hook up to a sump or something like that, so that you can
oh yeah, I mean, more and more, yes, but I mean, Green Fab is like right there. They do that. There's Collective Carpentry, there's BC Passive House, there's BC Timber Frame, a lot of them are in BC. Method Homes up in Bellingham area. There's a ton of different companies that do that, and more and more and more as this market grows, of course, there's going to be more of that available.
So like, what is the efficiency difference? Like, I just want to understand is it more efficient to make in a factory or produce?
Do you mean energy efficient or like time efficient? Or?
Like passive zero, from environment point of view, like if we are considering environment, which is better, like to have a unit manufactured in a factory and then just placing it there, or just making it there itself with the, like, which is more standard?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend a ton on the durability of the building. So if it's built poorly in the factory, then it's going to be worse, right? But if it's assuming it's a really great building that was built, from waste management standpoint, I'd say factory built is probably more efficient than site built in general, but you guys should answer.
So manufactured housing or panelized construction, there's a lot of different ways to transfer the processes that commonly happen on site to a facility and then bring them out. They have tremendous potential for good quality control, for speed of construction, for better system integration. So there's a lot of potentials. Now, why are we not building that way? Why are they so, I mean, there's a bunch of builders in the area, but they're all boutiques.
Yes.
So they're all like, oh, we'll build you a fancy house, or build you a fancy project. And it's not less expensive. There's no, the only general economic savings that people have demonstrated in our region is that it can take some time off your construction schedule. You know, partially this is because we have such an evolved industry here, and you know, I mean, Ted can frame a house in 2 weeks. He can get a shell up, and you know, he can get a roof on it in 3 weeks.
Found that we're quite a bit faster than any of the manufactured housing operations at building a house on site.
That's
So-
probably worth saying in the mic. That's
Yeah, yeah. Just, so we're really good at building them on site here, and when you get to Europe or places where there's concentrations of population concentrations that are higher, even in the eastern seaboard U.S., you'll see more of it. But there, because it may be.
Wow. Oh, this is
Trying to
the.
cue this up with Ted talking about how quick you can build a house.
I don't know where the mute is.
We don't usually move that fast. But if you watch the sun, you can see how long it takes, how many days it takes to frame 2 houses next to each other. Yeah, we mostly just do coffee. We're pretty standard, but I think it was 7 days start to finish for the 2 houses.
Those are your SIPs panels?
Those are the SIPs panels, so that's a stack of SIPs that we're, yeah. And we set everything by hand except for the roof. So a lot of people ask, well, do you use a crane? You know, how do you do it? We typically have, 4 to 6 guys on site when we're setting panels. And, so we can do most of the setting just by hand. We get a little, what's the word, gung-ho? Well, the thing is, you can't stop to put handrails around something when it's just as fast as just put the walls up. So you can see, in the time it takes to build a handrail, you can put the walls in place. So, and then, look on the roof. When we set the roof panels, we tend to go pretty quick. You couldn't even tie off to anything. You'd be constantly moving whatever you were tying off to. So we just, I think it's on Facebook.
I believe you had a question?
Just those panels, you have to design the house and order the panels. Every panel is cut out at the factory.
Yes.
So you
Now,
puzzle together on that.
when I worked for my dad's construction company and we first started building panel houses, he bought the panels and we cut them all out ourselves
Ooh,
on site.
brutal.
And we didn't like it very much. It's much better when they show up and they're all pre-cut out and all. So yeah, you just send them your plans. And obviously, the simpler you can keep it, the thing that SIPS does great is large planar surfaces. So if you want this big sweeping roof line, that's,